Very much for that. Woo! Hi everyone. So my name is Chris, incoming master's student, and hello. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about moral judgments, how we come to make certain moral decisions, and then some pretty interesting, or at least what I think are interesting findings in neuroscience. More or less, what I'm going to do today is talk a tiny bit about the background, what's been going on in psychology as the field has developed, how the current what the current understanding of decision making is, more or less, in neuroscience, the neuroanatomy of moral judgments, and then how similar we can get decision making and moral judgments to be, because at the end of the day they're types of choices we need to make, but can we equivocate them? And then I'll talk about some preliminary findings in fMRI studies, kind of hinting towards, maybe there are certain areas of the brain that are more responsible for modulating emotion as opposed to modulating other sorts of cognitive capacities or cognitive abilities. And then at the end, I'll try and tie it back to philosophy and to see if any of this empirical stuff has anything to say or anything meaningful to contribute to philosophy and to the questions in moral philosophy. So historically speaking, psychology has been a big fan of philosophy. Right, you had like this guy Aristotle talking about the virtues, got to cultivate them, and if you do so, you'll make some good moral decisions. Then you got Kant over there, he came by and he's like, okay, wait, no, we have these imperatives and these duties that we must abide by, we just cannot kill, there are lines we cannot cross. And then you have people like Mills, or the student of Bentham, and he was just like, wait, sometimes maybe we should kill if it means the greater good type stuff. So all of this is to say that psychology is kind of picked up from this. Right? This is where it took off. And it started off with, Daddy Freud. He was all about, okay, all of these moral judgments you're making, when you decide what to do, what's good, what's wrong, really what's going on is just this emotional, non-rational process going on in the subconscious, right? And then that's what ends up coming out when you make these choices and decisions. Then came along the experimental psychologists, and they were of the idea that we gain these moral capacities as we grow up and as we develop these abilities to reason abstractly, right? So they're not things that really, really young kids have. It's something that we kind of develop as we get older. And then the more prominent, but definitely not agreed upon, theory or view of moral judgments is Greene's proposal, this dual process theory. And it's the idea that, okay, well, yes, there are some emotional aspects. Yes, there are some rational, higher order aspects to decision making and moral processes, but at the end of the day, it's a battle between these two systems and oftentimes competing systems. And then that's what leads us to make the final call. And so one neat experiment that I think shows how we come to make decisions, morality aside, was this Knudsen paper. So what they did essentially was they got a couple participants, they brought them into the lab, and they asked them to rate these three consumer goods, or these types of consumer goods. How much do you like each of these, basically, was what they were asked. And then, depending on how much these things were liked, they were assigned monetary values, right? So here, they probably liked Jenga a lot more. They reported they liked it a lot more than ebooks. Then what they did is they stuck them in an fMRI, and they started asking them questions. You have a certain amount of money. Obviously not enough to buy all of them, but you need to make a decision. Which one will you buy? And what they found was that when they were thinking about how much they liked the object, or thinking about the object they liked very much, the nucleus accumbens showed heightened activation. When they were deliberating or thinking about the financial cost of these products, the insula was kind of activating a little bit more. And the interesting thing is that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex here, this is what was kind of deliberating between both of those systems. So information was being fed to the medial prefrontal cortex from the NACC and the insula, and then a decision was kind of made. And this is the model that's been driving decision making in neuroscience, more or less. We have the VMPFC here, and it's trying to weigh all of the options that we have. Whether or not to buy the book, whether or not to buy it, save the money, spend the money, etc. And what it's trying to do, or at least what the model suggests it's trying to do, is assign all of these choices weights. So it's trying to take every possible outcome, what would be the best one? And it's taking all of this information from preceding brain regions in very convoluted and complex ways that I had no way do I completely understand or have the time, if I did understand, to talk about all that. But it's taking all this information in, and then it needs to make a unilateral decision at the end of the day. They can't just choose everything. So this is just normal decision making. This isn't moral decision making. There's something that seems to be a little bit different about moral decisions than pragmatic and practical ones. So, a lot of research has been going on with these types of decisions, right? And neuroscientists have been trying to find neural correlates that are only related to moral decision making, and they haven't really been able to find any conclusively. So what's the consensus, more or less? Well, there's still debate, obviously, but they're kind of forced to say, well, there might not be a categorical difference between these two types of decisions. At the end of the day, it might just be a different type of species of decision, right? And so in comes Greene, and he says, well, I have this theory of how we explain emotions, of how we deliberate these types of moral decisions, deliberate on these moral decisions. And we have two systems that are working, and oftentimes in conflict. We have a deliberate, slow cognitive system, which is working oftentimes against the more automatic, effective, and emotional system. And so one experiment that he kind of pioneered that got a lot of attention was a type of moral dilemma, or presenting participants with types of moral dilemma. One of these types of moral dilemma is what you would call a personal moral dilemma. A moral dilemma in which there is like a visceral, in-your-face emotional response to what you need to do. So this would be akin to pushing the man onto the railroad tracks, harvesting organs, something where you're face-to-face with a choice. Other ones, a moral impersonal dilemma, is something closer to pushing a button from far away, being in a different area, or just having to pull the lever. And then, as just control, they had, which coupons would you use in a store? Would you rather take the train or the bus, and so on? And so they found the activations, or the differences in activations through some fancy ANOVA regressions of these studies. This is a picture here of the moral brain, or what we think to be the moral brain. So the areas of the brain that are associated with aspects of decision making. Like the amygdala, obviously, you guys are probably familiar with that, deals with emotions. Or the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, like we just kind of talked about, it deliberates between emotions. And so what he found in this study was that when he was showing individuals moral dilemmas that were of personal type, or personal types, there was significantly increased activation in emotional areas of the brain. Whereas impersonal, or non-moral ones, we were deliberating and using a slower type of reasoning to come to those conclusions. And so, what does this say? Well, Greene suggests, and you can agree or disagree, but Greene suggests that maybe when it comes to moral personal decisions, so in-your-face type of moral decisions, this has a little bit more weight. This side, this mode of thinking has a bit more weight than the other one. Whereas when it comes to moral impersonal ones, it's more of a slower, deliberate type of thinking. And so, another study that came a little bit after that he thinks strengthens his argument, is this one, where they got 6 patients with lesions to their ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And you can see in the red, that's where they overlap and damage. And as it spreads out, it's where they stop overlapping and damage. And they asked them these same types of moral questions. And what did they find here? Well, they found with the personal moral judgments, or the in-your-face type of moral judgments, that the people with damaged VMPCs tended to give far more utilitarian responses to these moral dilemmas than people with brain damage in other areas, or people with atypical or typical brains. And so, what does this kind of tell us? Well, there's neural correlates. Just checking my time. Nice. So there's neural correlates to the moral judgments that we engage in. When we're engaging in more utilitarian type, I don't want to say like utilitarian rigid, but utilitarian type moral judgments, lower activation in the VMPC, increased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And then with deontological type of choices or moral choices, increased or normal activation in the VMPC, and then decreased dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activation, the one that's more deliberate and slow when we're thinking about things. And so here I kind of like, I didn't know how many people would show up, but now that a couple people showed up, I kind of want to run a little survey, a mini one. So in this one, who would feel confident that they would just pull the lever? Show of hands. Easily pull lever, sacrifice 1 for 5. Okay, cool. And then what about this one? Literally shove a guy. Would you be able to literally shove a guy? Anyone?
Who's the guy?
Strangers, you don't know. You don't really know, but you gotta push him. No one would push this guy. All right. So that kind of goes more or less in line with the findings. Most people have no issue whatsoever pushing or pulling the lever to kill one guy. People have a really, really hard time though pushing the man, getting in their face. Why? Because maybe there's like an emotional aspect going on, this type of arousal that is inhibiting these utilitarian decisions. And so I ran my own like little survey. I don't know if some of you guys know, but I have a little Instagram page, and yesterday night I ran a little poll to see, well, what do people think? How do they think we should reason? And so I asked them, okay, well, should we reason according to our emotions, according to our reason, mostly emotions, mostly reason? And this seems a little bit counterintuitive to what the normal people in these surveys are suggesting. Right here they're saying we should mostly use deliberate reasoning, but with the studies we just kind of saw, that's not what people are usually doing. So I found that kind of interesting. So Greene's suggestion after like these studies and whatnot, he's saying, well, people's deontological judgments seem to be not extremely, but very, very strongly influenced by the emotional and what he considers morally irrelevant factors to these dilemmas, right? Like how close you are to the person, whether or not the person is tall or short, things like that shouldn't really have a weight for the significance of someone's life. So maybe we should err on the side of consequentialism when we're not really sure about the moral problem as a whole. So philosophy solved? No, definitely not. Like there's no way that this empirical, these neuroscientific discoveries have anything to say for the whole dilemmas, for all the dilemmas we're like dealing with. But I don't think that they're meaningless. I don't think that they're just like vapid findings. They have very little to say about this ought question, right? Ought we pull the lever or not? But I think what they can do, to some extent, is to guide our questions and make them a little bit more precise. So instead of asking, well, is it reason or is it emotion that's driving these moral judgments? Maybe instead we can start to ask questions like, well, should we allow certain emotional aspects to have a heavy influence on our moral decision making? But that's basically all I got for today. A little bit short, but yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Good work, Chris. Right, questions? Go ahead, Alex.
So a lot of your talk revolved around the idea of identifying our thinking processes with neurological processes. And you seem to be identifying areas of the brain with emotional reasons and clinical reasons. Do you think that can be accurately done? So if we had a person where their whole brain was wired in an emotional capacity, would they not be able to even understand clinical reasons? Conversely, you had.
Yeah, well, I think it would be hard to find a person with no critical like areas of their brains. But what I can say to that is that, like, I do think that and like this goes back to like a lot of studies that I didn't talk about here, but there does seem to be consensus that we, to some extent, can understand the functions of very local regions and the roles that they have to play in decision making, right? Does that kind of answer your question? Or sorry?
We can move on and we can talk about it later.
We should probably move on. Lovely. Victoria.
Yes. So on the slide with the tug of war, the categorization of the utilitarian and deontological categorization.
Yeah.
Could you explain how those different features fall within each of those categories? I feel like I might have missed that.
Yeah, fair. Well, so Greene calls this a manual/deliberate mode of thinking, and then calls this one an automatic mode of thinking. And the reasoning is that when the ventrometer prefrontal cortex is lesioned, there's no longer information from the emotional sides or emotional parts of the brain informing your decision. So when there's none of that, all of a sudden you become utilitarian. And it's those areas of the region that usually tend to err on these types of, that have these characteristics, or these cognitive correlates, let's call them.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Catherine.
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. So my question is about this contrast between reason and emotion that you operate with kind of throughout. So I guess I'm wondering how comfortable you are kind of working with that contrast and how, like, where that comes from. Is that contrast arising out of, like, what we study the brain, we just see these, reason stuff happening one place and emotion stuff happening on the other place? Or is reason versus emotion a dichotomy that's kind of being brought to the study of the brain as something like a presupposition? And I think just like one good example of why I'm a bit suspicious of that distinction, if like I don't know, just think about some kind of kindness and compassionate thing for my partner that I might not do for just anybody, it's not like reasons are absent for that. The reason that the fact that they're my partner is reason giving, is a reason why I do for them what I might not do for someone else. So, but there's also a feeling. So it's not easy to categorize that as like, oh, that's emotional and has nothing to do with reasons.
Yeah.
So I'll not labor that point more. But I just want maybe comment a bit more on this reason versus emotion, and it seems like quite a sharp dichotomy.
No, yeah, it completely is, and that's how he kind of, or how Greene kind of illustrates it. But I'm more along the lines of thinking that they can feed into each other, right? So reason can inform emotion, emotion can inform reason, and there's a lot of back and forth that goes on in the brain while this happens. Like if you saw this one of the earlier, this little diagram, this is terribly simplistic of like how our brain is informed. It's not in a one-way street, right? Our brains don't just work from like this area to that area. There's a lot of feedback, right? So our reasoning capacities can also inform emotional capacities, and so on and so on.
You feel like you're confident saying they just are two different things, reasoning capacities, emotional.
I think there are some areas of the brain that are tied a lot more to emotional things than reason things.
Okay, Joe.
I was wondering about, so you cited study of prefrontal cortex using utilitarian reasoning. I'm wondering, so this was 2007, I think you said, right? Have there been replication efforts of this one? Because I remember a while ago reading about utilitarianism being linked with being drunk. That was a really fun thing that came out, but it was just bad.
So like in the world of neuroscience, that is years in, like that is centuries ago. That is old news. But there were a lot of recent ones that were able to correlate those same regions, like the ventrometer prefrontal cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, to similar type of decisions. Sometimes with moral ones, but then sometimes also it was just between non-moral decisions, right, where they were deliberating between those. But those studies came out, or the most recent one I saw was like a 2022 meta-analysis of like 1,000 patients, and they saw that these are reasonable assumptions to be making for the responsibility of certain brain regions. Yeah.
If I'm not jumping the queue.
Very quickly, Victoria, and then we should wrap up.
Are there any studies that show the reverse, that different areas of the brain having lesions associated with more deontological ethical decisions? Or is it just the one way?
Not that I know of, but what you can say is that the more active or let's say like pronounced the ventrometer prefrontal cortex is, the more likely someone is to spit out a deontological decision. But I don't know, and I haven't read anything about lesionings or brain damage.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, guys.
Our next talk will kick off at 3 o'clock sharp, so